Hello everyone. My name is Mandar Dharmadhikari, and I'm going to present a topic which I'm given to understand that has quite some interest in the community. And the topic basically is Power Automate and Logic Apps. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And how you can get started with the decision making process on choosing the correct tech for solving the correct problem. Right. So even though the session is called Logic Apps versus Power Automate, what I will be doing is I'll be comparing and contrasting the two technologies, and then we'll see how we can set up a decision making process so that we can come to a conclusion on selecting a particular technology for a particular requirement. So a little bit about me. I'm Mandar, and I am currently working as a manager at Accenture, and I am uh, heading projects mainly in Azure and Power Platform area, and I work as basically a Azure and Power Platform architect. Plus, sometimes when the times call, I also do the development work as and when required. I'm also interested in building projects using agile and continuous delivery paradigms. So I enjoy speaking about that as well. Now you'll see a few of the links for my GitHub, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me, yeah, let's connect. Now the agenda for the session today is we will compare and contrast different features of Power Automate and Logic Apps, and then we'll take a simple use case and we will go through each of the requirement and we'll make a decision whether to use Power Automate or Logic Apps for that particular piece of requirement. So before we move on to the Power Automate or Logic Apps, let me give you a quick refresher on Power Platform, or as I call it, a basic introduction about it. I'll not be speaking much about Azure because uh, Dear Azure already conducts a lot of sessions on Azure as a whole, right? So I'm expecting that the listeners have a basic idea of Azure. So for Power Platform, we can define Power Platform in using what I call the 4 A's, or rather what Microsoft calls the 4 A's that an organization goes through, and I call it the virtuous feedback loop. Right? So it is something similar to the quotes that we see on the t-shirts. Eat, work out, sleep, repeat, or eat, work, sleep, study, repeat. Something along those lines, right? So this loop actually talks about the activities that an organization has to do uh, to be successful in their business. Now there are multiple stages in it, right? So we have our act, wherein we have our act wherein we are turning the ideas into organizational solutions by enabling or by building or creating the apps that solve the problems of the workers of that particular organization. So for example, let's say we want to enable the workers to have a leave application, or rather a app which allows them to apply for a leave quickly, right? So that is something that comes into an idea because it is solving a problem of applying a leave maybe with a click of a button or something like that. The second place wherein the organization can act is to deliver vital information to customer by building low code or no code based business website. So example for this would be a FAQ portal wherein the customers of an organization can go and check solution to their simple problems, or it can be as complex as creating a website which allows the users to buy insurance policies or apply for loans. Right? So this is the act phase wherein organization has to act by creating out applications or websites which solve certain problems either for the internal organization employees or for the customers or prospective customers. Then you have your automate. So again, automate talks about boosting the productivity of the employees by automating the organizational process, and it again moves back to the sample scenario of leave application that I just talked about, right? So we can write flows or automation workflows to allow that app to allow the user to submit a leave request with a click of a button. Then you have your assist phase, wherein you are engaging with the customer by providing them solution through the conversational bots. Either they are AI enabled or simple bots which go through FAQ solutions, but you are building something to assist out. And again, in assistance comes the website that I just talked about a minute ago. By that, we can basically deliver low code business websites for providing simple pieces of information to customer. And another example of assist would be building a customer service portal wherein they can submit their queries and such. So once that is done, the final stage in the loop is basically sorry, there is a mislabel there, but it should say analyze rather than assist. But so whenever we are doing acting, automation, and assist, we are engaging either with the employees or the customers, and that engagement should generate some sort of analytics for the organization just to make them understand that whether the stuff they are doing is hitting the mark or whether they are doing it correctly or not. For that, the analysis phase comes into the loop, wherein the organization keeps on analyzing what it has done in the past and derive the insights from it, and then again start the loop by acting, automating, and assisting based upon the previous analysis that was done. So this is how the virtuous feedback loop for organization works, and it allows them to provide value to the customers as well as the internal employees. Now, if I take a look at the central piece here, you'll see that the main actors here are nothing but the employees of the organization. Now, the question here arises, are these pro developers or are these business analysts or are these completely sales guys? Well, the answer to that is it depends, right? So sometimes it is necessary that for a company to be successful, it has to release certain things quickly to market to get a quick feedback on whether they are hitting the nerve of a customer or not, right? So for that purposes, it is necessary that the BAs, the salespersons, the marketers, right? They have the ability of creating applications and websites. So the solution to that is that they simply can't just write code, right? So the solution to that is a low code, no code set of services which allows these so-called citizen developers, right? That is what Microsoft calls them, citizen developers, to allow them to build these apps and release them to the customers or employees internally and enter through this feedback loop. So this is where the Power Platform comes in. So your Power Platform is nothing but it's a platform that caters to the low code, no code paradigm of software development. It provides different tools which works seamlessly with each other and other Microsoft suite of products like Azure, Microsoft 360 products like Teams, Outlook 365, etc. Now, the interconnectedness of the tools allow the citizen developers with the business knowledge to churn out the apps and automation and AI models and even analytics quickly, which allows the organization to be very agile and nimble. Right. So this does bring up one important question. Does that mean we do not need to actually have pro developers anymore? Well, the answer to that is no. We still need pro developers because the Power Platform basically gives you the agility by boosting the productivity of the workers and bringing in citizen developers in the fold to release the tools or MVPs. When I say MVP, it's minimal viable product to the market quickly and to get analytics or insights from whether what we have released or what the organization has released is correct or not, right? Once they get the feel of that, they can engage the pro developers afterwards, right? So this is how I see the Power Platform, right? So it's a tool which allows the organization to be agile while deriving insights from what they are doing and then allowing the pro developers to come in and deliver a more tailored experience. Right? So that was a quick introduction on Power Platform. Now let's quickly do a quick introduction on Power Automate. Right? So your Power Automate is one of the parts of the Power Platform, and it is a set of low-code automation workflow services. Right? So Power Platform comes with hundreds of connectors and pre-built templates. So when I say 100 of connectors, I basically mean that Microsoft has already built connectors which connect to different systems like Jira, Teams, Outlook, your Excel, other Microsoft 365 suite of products, other external third-party services as well, right? So these connectors allow the developers, or rather citizen developers, to communicate with these complex systems by configuring just few values. And then there are hundreds of pre-built templates that Microsoft has released, which cater to certain set of common problems that the developers or the citizen developers might face while boosting their productivity. And all these connectors and templates ultimately allow the citizen developer to automate their mundane tasks or even mission critical tasks in your project, right? So what are those mission critical tasks? We'll see them when we discuss a use case. Now, Power Automate generally comprises of the following different types of flow. So you have your digital process automation flow, wherein you can automate business processes like approvals, say team creation, employee onboarding process. These flows basically can be scheduled, automated, say triggered from the cloud or triggered from the mobile applications using Power Automate, mobile, etc. Then you have your robotic process automation flows. These are also called as desktop flows. Now these allow the developers or the citizen developers to automate tasks wherein generally APIs are not provided by the backend system. So the example to this would be, let's say we have a policy issuance system which was built way back in 90s or early 2000s using VB.NET and does not expose a set of either WCF or SOAP or even REST services, right? So but it does have a UI to work with. So how do we automate that? The solution to that is we use the desktop flow. We record different actions that a person might perform on that UI, and then we automate it through the desktop flow by feeding necessary information at different places. Right? Then you have your third type of Power Automate flow, which is business process flow. Now, the example for this would be, say, a policy issuance process, right, or any other process while we are purchasing something, right? So, if we take the example of policy issuance, what the general steps there would be that you collect the information for the applicant first, then you collect the information of the risk, that is the object that you are insuring, then you collect the information about different claims history for that particular person, and then basically you issue a quote after capturing all this information. So if you take a look at this, each of these is part of a process or a step of a process. So the ideal way to allow someone to capture that information is to create a guided experience wherein they go step by step, that first get the applicant information, second get the risk information, third get the claims information, and then call something which generates a quote for the customer, right? So this guided experience is what we call the business process flow, and we generally use that when we are building model-driven applications. Now I'll do a quick introduction about Logic Apps. So Azure Logic Apps is a cloud platform, and it comes, or rather it is under the Azure umbrella of products, and it allows us to create and run automated workflow, again using the low-code software design paradigm. Logic App again has 100 of customers and pre-built templates which allow the automation of mundane tasks and mission critical tasks in a very easy way. Again, the examples would be similar to what we discussed in Power Automate. Then your Logic Apps generally come in two flavors. One is your consumption. So this mode allows the organization to deploy the Logic Apps in a multi-tenant environment, wherein, as the name suggests, consumption, you only pay for what you use. So the number of times your trigger is hit, your actions are hit, or your workflow is run, you'll be charged according to that. Then you have your standard Azure Logic App standard, which is like the new introduction done by Microsoft now. So this mode allows the organization to get dedicated compute and storage space to run their logic apps and to segregate it from the multi-tenant architecture, so to speak. But the uh, side, or rather the billing for this changes a little bit, because in the Azure Logic App standard you have to pay for certain resources, and which is something we'll discuss later down when we are comparing and contrasting features for Power Automate and Logic Apps. So this is your very high level introduction to Power Automate and Logic Apps. I know it's very high level, but again the topics are so vast that we cannot go into that much depth in one session, because I'll be talking about it for maybe 5, 6, 8 hours. Right. So I've tried to keep it at a very high level. Now let's do a comparison between Power Automate and Logic Apps. So we'll contrast and basically compare the similarities and difference between the two services, and we will do it on following parameters, right? So we'll do comparison on service subscriptions, we'll do on how the service is organized, we'll talk a little bit about security, we'll talk about how the design and build experience for a Power Automate or Logic Apps is. We'll talk a little bit about operations and ALM, and then we'll talk about governance. So let's take the first criteria. So your service subscription. So your Power Automate is your SaaS offering from Microsoft as part of Power Platform. So SaaS basically means it's a software as a service wherein Microsoft is providing you the ability to create and to some extent manage workflows by hiding all the implementation details in the backend. Right? So your Power Automate is basically multi-tenant in nature. What it means that Microsoft manages, or rather your environment or Power Platform flows which you build are deployed on a tenant which is shared by other companies. It's the responsibility of Microsoft to segregate and protect the data of your organization from that of the other organization, right? So the way it does that is through the use of Azure Active Directory, because Power Automate are by default connected and integrated with the Azure Active Directory for a particular organization. And later down the comparison, we'll see how this Active Directory and other security features that we can use to protect our data. Right? So on the other hand, if you take a look at Logic Apps is actually a platform as a service offering by Microsoft, and Microsoft calls it an integration platform as a service. Right? So the utility of Azure Logic Apps is given away by the way Microsoft defines it. It's integration platform as a service. So basically it means that Azure Logic Apps can do a lot more than what Power Automate can do. Right? So Logic Apps supports both multi-tenant as well as single tenant options. So multi-tenant option is again same, supported by consumption, wherein you are deploying your Logic Apps to the server instances shared by different organizations in the backend, and Microsoft manages how the access to your Logic Apps and how your data is protected. As we talked, Microsoft recently released Azure Logic Apps standard, which allows us to buy dedicated compute space as well as storage space, so that the Logic Apps that we deployed reside within that space, and that space is limited to the single tenant that is owned by that particular organization, right? So that's provides another layer of abstraction from this multi-tenant paradigm. So is multi-tenant bad or is single tenant good? No, it's not that simple. It again depends upon the use case that you have, because even with the multi-tenant, the security features of Microsoft are first class, right? So we don't need to worry that much about the security. And Azure Logic Apps is again integrated out of the box with Azure Active Directory. So these, as you'll see that there are certain similarities between Power Automate and Azure Logic Apps, which start to stem the question that we are trying to answer today, which technology to choose, right? So along those lines, let's continue to service organization. Now let's understand how Power Automate is organized, or Power Automate flows are organized in a rather in an environment, right? So Power Platform is basically organized on the concept of environment. So inside your uh, or rather the environments are connected to your Azure Active Directory tenant, and you have the ability of creating multiple environments in Power Platform. So environment is nothing but it's a grouping, if you will, of particular entities which serve particular purpose. So example for this would be you have one environment for development, you have one environment for UAT, you have one environment for production. You can even go further by segregating production into, you have production for sales department, you have production for marketing, you have production for customer service, something along those lines, right? So your environment houses the related entities, and the way that you can designate an environment again depends upon the way your organization is rather depends upon the process that your organization is following, right? So you can have as simple as development, UAT, QA, production, or you can have development, UAT, QA, production sales, production marketing, so on and so forth, right? Now the environment allows us to as I said, group together different entities, and Power Automate flows is one of them. Now the access to these environments and Power Automates can be controlled using first by using security groups, which allows users of Active Directory to be clubbed together into groups, and these groups can be provided access to the environment. So simple example for this would be, we can create a production security group for sales team and production security group for marketing team, and then individual security group has access to the individual environments, right? So the one group cannot see the other group's production environments and vice versa, right? And then we can implement more levels of control using Power Platform teams and business unit, right? So I'm not going too much into detail into that because that's a separate topic in itself. Now, Power Automate can be built directly under the context of the user which is logged in into the portal, or it can be created as a common process which is used by the applications in the environment, right? So to give an example of this, let's say I want to create an application or a Power Automate flow wherein I can update my location through my mobile phone into Teams, for example, just by adding a comment, right? So that flow is something that is very private to me. So that flow I will create under the context of my user. And then let's take an example of the other one, right? That we are creating a flow to get the details captured from the website and insert it into different Dataverse table. Now this flow is something that is very local to a website, and different users can run it, or even the guests can run it as and when required, right? So the context depends, right? So the Power Automate allows us to create flows which are under user context, as well as certain flows which are used by the generic process, and the such generic processes flows we can group together under solutions, right? So that it provides ALM in a better way. Now Power Automate can be accessed, built, managed through the Power Automate portal, and it provides a streamlined view of related activities. So if you see the portal that or the view of a portal that I've shown here, it provides a very I would not say restricted, but a very specific view to Power Automate only, right? So you have your home wherein you can see your different Power Automates. You can go to check the templates, you can check the connectors that you have, you can monitor it, you can use Process Advisor and AI Builder and all. So anything that you need to do and work with Power Automates, you see here. Now let's go to Azure Logic Apps for a minute. Now Azure Logic Apps, for this, the Azure resources are generally organized using a hierarchy of subscription and resource groups. Now each subscription and resource group and Logic App can be treated as a separate entity, and the organization generally would be that inside a subscription is a resource group, and inside a resource group is a Logic App. So that way, again, we can segregate different environments either based upon subscriptions or either based upon resource groups, meaning you can have a subscription for a organization, and then you have different resource groups for development, lower environments, and then production, or you can have different subscriptions altogether. Now, the each subscription and resource group and logic app is a separate entity, and what it does is it allows the organizational admins to set up security and governance guidelines either in a hierarchical way or on an individual fashion, which is something that I will talk about just in few minutes. Now, uh, the access to the logic apps basically can be controlled by using access to the subscription, limiting the access to a resource group, and to even an individual logic app using what we call the role-based access control in Azure. So we can have RBAC on subscription, we can have RBAC on resource group, which flows down hierarchically to a logic app, or we can have RBAC directly on individual logic app. So, or we can do a mix and match of all these just to get to a security profile that suits the organization best. Right? Then Azure logic apps are built under the context of a resource group, right? So you do not have a context of a user or a user, right? So the logic apps are basically generic in nature, and they are built directly inside the resource group. Now, Azure logic apps can be built and deployed using Azure Portal or Visual Studio Core or simply Visual Studio IDE. Right, the portal experience in this case is very generic in nature, and you'll see that it derives basically from the larger standard experience for most of the Azure services, where you have your overview, activity log, access control, tags, which is very common to all the Azure services, right? So your Power Automate differs there. Since it's a SaaS offering, it provides a very streamlined view of the related activities to a Power Automate. Now, let's quickly move on to security. So, in Power Automate, Azure Active Directory serves as a primary security level, right? And then, as I spoke few minutes ago, we can introduce environment security groups and out-of-the-box and custom security roles to control access to different environments. The API connectivity in Power Automate. So if you look at the Power Automate, you'll see that all of the things that we are doing are done through a set of REST APIs in the backend by Microsoft, right? That's the way it is created. That most of these connectors that you see, they have some sort of REST interface in the backend, which is hidden from us, and the API connectivity in this case is secured through protocols like SAML, OAuth, HTTPS, service principals, etc. Right? Then Power Automate has a capability of connecting with the on-premises systems, and we can do it through the on-premises data gateway, which again is a secure feature. And then another feature for Power Automate is that when you are grouping together certain actions and trigger, the Power Platform allows you to define policies that certain triggers can only be used with certain connectors, right? So that is the concept of your data loss prevention policy, which basically allows you to segregate and control the exchange of data between different connectors. Right? Then you have your licenses in Power Automate, which serve as another layer of security, because if you do not have the necessary licenses, so even though you have access to the environment, you cannot access that Power Automate flow. I'm sorry, there is some disturbance in the backend. Is it from me, or someone is gone out of mute?
No, it's all fine from here, Mandar. We are not hearing any disturbance, kind of.
I think someone just came out of mute, right? So.
Okay, let me check.
I think it's better now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Kasam. Now let's quickly look at the security for Azure Logic Apps, right? So Azure AD again serves as the primary security level. Further restrictions can be placed either on the subscriptions or resource group or even individual logic apps using the role-based access control. And again, we can play around it and mix and match different uh, RBAC controls at different levels to arrive at a profile that suits the organization best. The API connectivity in case of Azure Logic Apps again is secured through latest security protocols like SAML, Auth, easy auth, private endpoints, HTTPS, managed identity, service principal, IP restrictions, etc. So you'll see that Azure Logic Apps has way more security protocols which it can support, right? And again, it depends upon the type of scenario that you are actually trying to, or rather a problem that you are trying to actually solve. Right? Azure Logic Apps also allows us to connect to the systems that are on premises, and that can be again done through the on premises data gateway, which is like a commonality between your Power Automate and Azure Logic Apps. Now, Azure Logic Apps can be Azure Logic Apps and related resources can be grouped together, and the connectivity can be limited to this using virtual networks, right? So this is something that is implemented in Logic App Standard and ISC, right? So for example, if you are building a system wherein you have a database and 10 Logic Apps, and no other system needs to access that database, all you can do is put those all 10 Logic Apps and the database behind a virtual network and restrict the access to it. So that's how that VNet integration provides the added layer of security for Azure Logic Apps. So let's now quickly check on design and build. Right? So in case of your Power Automate, you have this drag and drop of low code mode of development wherein you basically select the action, configure certain properties on it, and your flow is good. Then in case of Power Automate, your design time errors are identified using the flow checker, which basically means that if you are doing something wrong in the flow and there is a, so to speak, compile time error, that compile time error is identified by the flow checker, which sits on the left hand side of the, right hand side of the flow window. Now there are hundreds of connectors built to connect with different systems, which can be Office 365 suite of products, or even other Power Automate to services like AI Builder or Power Virtual Agent, or even other external services like Jira, ServiceNow, etc., based upon our requirement. Right. So a lot of connectors are there, and lots of connectors are added regularly. Now these ready-made templates that I spoke of a few minutes ago, which gives you a standard way of solving a particular problem which someone has already solved, makes your life easier. Now Power Automate has a high cohesion with Microsoft 365 and other Power Platform services, which basically means that it is very easy to integrate Power Automate with Microsoft 365 suite of products like Office 365, Teams, to-do lists. Then Power Platform services like Power Virtual Agent, model-driven apps, Canvas apps, your Dataverse, AI Builder, Power BI, right? All of these, there is a high cohesion since all of these reside into the same low-code, no-code paradigm of software development. So the integrating with those is very easy using Power Automate. Now, it's so when you want to have certain requirements like setting up teams, or you have integration with different Power apps like model driven apps or Canvas apps, or you want to do certain sort of approval flows or managing the data in the Dataverse environment, it's very easy to use the Power Automate because of the high cohesion that I just spoke about. Now, there are certain downsides to Power Automate as well, and that those come down to your licensing front. So your Power Automate has this concept of premium and non-premium connectors, wherein the premium connector requires a special licensing condition to be met. So these licensing conditions are something that I'm going to discuss in few minutes. So when designing or building things with Power Automate, one has to be very careful of the actions that they are using and whether they fall or whether they are allowed with the current licensing model or not, right? So that will become more clearer once we see the licensing structure for Power Automate. For Azure Logic Apps, you again have the same designer experience because Power Automate is kind of a high level abstraction of Logic Apps, and it runs internally with the on the same engine on which Azure Logic Apps work. Right? So Azure Logic Apps again has the drag and drop low code mode of development. Your design time errors in Logic Apps can be identified by the developers when they try to save the Logic App, because if there is a compile time error or if there is something wrong with the Azure Logic App, that when you are going to save it, Azure will start complaining and it will give you the exact error where it is occurring. Right? Again, Logic Apps has 100 of connectors built in to connect with the different system, which allows us to connect not only with third-party services but other Azure services, event grids, event hubs, creating VMs, so on and so forth. Right? So Azure Logic Apps has a wider umbrella of connectors that are available and can do a wider range of automation activities as compared to Power Automate. Right? So Azure Logic Apps has very basic approvals possible at this moment, right? So the approval process in Logic Apps is not as good as Power Automate, right? So if you have requirements wherein you're basically working with Microsoft 365 suite of products or Power Platform services, and you have the necessary license, Power Automate is your go-to tool. Now, the place where Azure Logic Apps branches out away from Power Automate is that Azure Logic Apps has a full support for building event-driven, highly distributed enterprise integration. So when I say all these things, what does it mean? So Azure Logic Apps allows us to connect to event grid, which allows us to build event-driven systems which can connect with each other based upon events emitted by different systems, and we can create highly distributed systems by virtue of using Azure Logic Apps and Azure Service Bus, so that we basically decouple them and distribute the systems which can scale independently of each other based upon the load that they have. Right. So this is partly possible with Power Automate, but not completely, because Power Automate has completely different use case. Right. So Azure Logic Apps starts to differ from Power Automate there, right? So your Power Automate has more mature cohesion with M365 suite of products and Power Platform services, while Azure has more maturity towards building an enterprise level integration platforms and doing a wider set of automations in the Azure ecosystem. Plus, Azure Logic App has a full support for B2B development scenarios, which uses your EDI and concept of parties, right? So that becomes very easy to implement using Azure Logic Apps. Now let's quickly talk about operations and ALM. So your Power Automate, as I said, the design time errors can be identified using flow checker. Now the Power Automate run history is available on the flow run details page, wherein you can see the last 30-40 entries. I guess I don't recall the exact number, but you see last n number of entries, and you can select each entry and then go see what details the flow processed, or if it failed, why it failed. So your compilation time errors are provided by flow checker, and the runtime errors are something that you can check in the run history. Now the performance of the connectors and error, etc. Can be monitored in more detail through the Power Platform Admin Center, right? And the application lifecycle management for Power Automate is a bit tricky, because Power Automate runs in the context of user as well as it runs under the general context. Plus, it has this concept of licenses attached to it. So the ALM for this becomes a bit tricky. Right? So if you are doing deployment from one environment to another environment, generally you have to figure out the licensing for that environment as well, the context as well, and then you'll also have to fix the connections that the flow uses to connect to the external systems, right? So the ALM is a bit tricky in Power Automate, but it's not impossible, right? It's just that one needs to get a bit opinionated about it, and once they acquire that opinion, it becomes easier to implement the ALM as well for Power Automate. Now, on the Logic App side of things, you have your design time error, as I said, are identified when the developers try to save the Logic App. And these errors are more verbose because pro developers are building these Azure Logic apps, and they actually tend to be low level of errors which tell you what exactly is wrong with something in the flow. Oh, sorry, the logic apps. Run history again can be checked in Azure portal, and in some cases it's available in Visual Studio as well in case of standards. Now for logic apps, measure metrics, error, etc. can be monitored in the Azure itself. And we have the ability of implementing in-depth observability. So you have the ability to track metrics, traces, and logging through Azure Monitor, and you can implement this three-legged stool of observability in a very robust way. Now, the advantage in Azure Logic Apps, or not advantage, the place where Azure Logic Apps is more mature at this point in time is it has a very streamlined application lifecycle management. So we can implement CI/CD setup in a very easy way through the use of Bicep and ARM templates, and we can control, or rather source control, the code inside the Azure Logic App, and we can set up the CI/CD accordingly, right? So deployment from one environment to another can be automated using these CI/CD pipelines, or if the organization is not yet mature to have CI/CD pipelines, then they can even do the manual deployment. But again, in case of manual deployment, connection fix is required in the higher environment, right? But Azure Logic Apps does not have this concept of licensing associated with it. Now, let's quickly look at the differences from a governance point of view, right? So in Power Automate, or in general for Power Platform, your Power Platform admin center serves as the central location for all Power Platform governance. Right? As I spoke few minutes earlier, you can implement different policies wherein you can control which connectors can interact with each other and exchange the data between them. And that is implemented through something called as data loss prevention policies. There are other auditing process and all, but I'll not go into too much depth there. The other important governance point is that we can implement cross-tenant restrictions for Power Automate, and again, same can be done through the Power Admin Center. And Microsoft provides this Center of Excellence Starter Kit, which is called as Power Platform Center of Excellence Starter Kit, which helps organization to set up their own Center of Excellence, because this Starter Kit provides them the guidelines to do so that they can have a robust governance in place for all the Power Platform services that they are using. Now, in case of Azure Logic Apps, the governance is rather simple. So you use the Azure IAM, that is Identity and Access Management, and you implement different role-based access control to different logic apps. Plus, you can control the wider behavior in Azure using the Azure policies. Right? So if anyone is interested in it, probably they can have a look at it separately, right? But the governance for Azure Logic Apps is basically governed by these two things: RBAC through Azure Identity and Access Management, and Azure policies. Now, the important point, licensing, right? So let me be very frank at this point. The licensing for Power Platform changes frequently, right? So whatever am I presenting now might change after, say, month or 2 months or 3 months, right? So if one wants to be abreast with the latest and greatest in the licensing guide, so they have to read or refer to the licensing guide when they are actually trying to implement something, right? So for Power Automate, the developers or system which are accessing and running these Power Automates need licenses to build and run them, right? Now, if an organization wants to utilize full capabilities of different Power Automate flows, like the RPA, the business process flows, and even the digital process automation flows that we just spoke about a few minutes ago, they'll have to use the dedicated licenses like Power Automate per user plan, which allows the running of Power Automate per user, or you can have Power Automate per user with attended RPA, so on and so forth, right? So as I said, there are different combinations of Power Automate dedicated licensing, which provide access to different types of connectors and have different number of run limitations, right? So if one is looking at using Power Automate, it becomes imperative for them to evaluate their use case and then go and check the licensing guide and determine which license would be the best for them. Now, in certain cases, the organization gets the right to use Power Automate if they purchase any of the following licenses, and the Power Automate licenses are seeded here, right? So the licenses like Power Automate per user plan or per user with attended RPA, these are paid licenses and dedicated to Power Automate only. But if an organization purchases licenses for Microsoft 365 or maybe Dynamics 365 CRM licenses, or if they have licenses for Power Apps, either per user or per app, in those case there they come with a seeded license for Power Automate with certain limitations on number of runs. So each parent license like Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365 will come with a Power Automate license which allows folks to run the license, the Power Automate flows in the context of the app or standalone, but it comes with certain limitations on number of runs and so on and so forth, right? So each license will have a different seeded Power Automate license. So again, you'll have to refer to the licensing guide to understand what your requirements are and whether a seeded Power Automate license solves your problem or not, right? Now, a note on use of premium connectors. The use of premium connectors differ in case of seeded and the dedicated licenses. Now, in case of seeded licenses, for example, if let's say we have a Canvas application which is making an API, or which rather has a flow which makes a call to the backend API, then the HTTP license connector that we use in a Power Automate is a premium connector. Now, if a person who is running that Power Apps has a dedicated Power Apps per user or per app license, then the user can run that Power Automate flow because the seeded license itself contains the capability of running the premium connectors, right? But as I said, if a user or a system is running the flow which is very generic in nature and not under the context of a particular user, then that particular user or system needs a dedicated Power Apps license or a Power Automate license to run the premium connectors. I know it's a bit daunting, but I hope I made it a little bit easier, or I'll be happy to take questions on this later on, right? So let me quickly cover up Azure Logic Apps. So Azure Logic Apps is very simple as compared to this. So for Azure Logic Apps, as we talked, there are two flavors mainly, multi-tenant and single tenant. So your multi-tenant is your Logic Apps consumption plan, wherein you pay only for what you use. So if say your flow has run only for 4 times and it has internally 8 actions, so you'll be paying only for the 4 executions and the 8 actions that were executed inside that Logic Apps, right? So that model is very simpler. So you do not incur any hidden charges or upfront charges. You only pay for what you use, and it's very cheap. Now, in case of standard, the pricing becomes a bit different. So this pricing for Logic Apps standard is governed by the standard plan, and it's based on different parameters like the virtual CPU and memory, the trigger actions and the trigger actions, plus the operations and the storage operations that you use, and even the integration accounts you use, right? Because you are requesting a dedicated compute and storage capacity from Microsoft. So the standard plan is a bit different, and one needs to again go and check based upon their requirements what would be the best option to avail inside that, right? So the licensing for Azure Logic Apps is simpler as compared to Power Automate. So I think that brings us to the end of the comparisons. Now let's quickly do a use case in next 5 minutes, and then we'll keep 5 minutes for question. Right, so let's take a use case of your Good Banking Corporation Limited. Now, Good Banking Corp Limited has a backend loans origination system which stores and manages the loans provided to different parties, right? So Good Banking Corporation is into commercial lending, and this origination system exposes an exhaustive set of APIs to provide a way to consume and update loan data. Plus, this bank has a customer management system built using VB.NET, and again, it's a desktop app and does not have a API sets available with it. Now, this bank plans to build a customer website which allows the prospective customers to submit loan applications through the website. Plus, the bank also plans to build on an underwriting application for the bank underwriters to make a decision on whether to approve the loan applications or not, right? Now, Based upon these, the main requirements for banking corporation are that they want faster go to market with a minimal viable product to start exploring if they are on correct track or not. Then they want to implement a guided loans origination process for the loans officer, plus they want to implement a guided underwriting process for the underwriters. And the last and generic requirement is implement the integration with the backend systems as required. Now let's analyze this. Let's take the first requirement, right? So faster go to market with the MVP to start exploring if they are on correct track or not, right? So as we discussed initially when we are talking about the Power Platform, your faster GTM means adoption of the low code, no code tools and services. So we go ahead and we select the Power Platform for this. Now, since we have selected Power Platform, we choose Azure as the cloud service provider due to the synergy between Power Platform and Azure. So that takes care of our first requirement. Now let's talk about implementing a guided underwriting process for the underwriters. Now, whenever in the banking environment, whenever there are big loans afoot where the bank has to give big loans out to someone, the underwriters generally come into place and they analyze the application provided by the requesters, and based upon different set of information that is available to them, they either generally internally confer with each other, have meetings, have calls, have tasks assigned to each other, and then they take a call whether to pass that application or not, right? So how to implement this? So as we have selected Power Platform first, we will implement the guided process through model driven apps with business process flow for guided experience. So as I talked about business process flow initially, whenever we want to implement a guided process somewhere wherein we want to give a step-by-step guide, visual guide to someone to do something, we implement it using business process flow and we'll integrate that into a model driven app, which will be connected to the Dataverse where the website will store the loan applications, right? Now, as I said, the underwriters, since underwriting is a very complex process, they might need to take approvals from senior underwriters, or they need to go meet with other underwriters who have assessed this similar kind of applications in the past, or they might want to have a chat, or they might want to update some data into the Dataverse, right? So this can be implemented using Power Automate because as we discussed earlier, Power Automate has a high cohesion with M365 and Power Platform set of services, right? So this is your ideal candidate where you use Power Automate and not Azure Logic Apps because of the synergy and the ease of integration that the Power Automate provides because of this synergy, right? So let's take a look at the next requirement, right? So implement a guided loans origination process for the loans officer. Now, once the loan application is created, a loan officer is assigned to it, and the underwriting is just part of the loan process, right? So there are other processes associated with the loan wherein the loan officer might need to verify the documents that the particular person has submitted, do background checks and so on and so forth, right? So this guided process again can be implemented using a Power Automate business process flow. Plus you can implement it inside a model driven app which is connected to the loan application Dataverse table, right? Now, once the underwriter okays that this particular loan can be passed, the loan now, since the record is in Dataverse, we need to sync that into the backend origination loan system, which exposes a set of APIs. Now, these APIs, think about it, these APIs are complex APIs. These APIs might require XSLT transformations, or they might require JSON to JSON complex transformations, wherein a full integration is required between the caller and the backend system, right? So in such cases, and even you need to consider that these APIs might be reused by another website that might come in tomorrow, which might not be the part of Power Platform, right? So we can build that maybe website using Sitecore, maybe we can build it using React. So in such cases, what you do is basically you orchestrate these APIs using Logic App, either by creating a facade or orchestrators on top of the origination system, and you secure those through API. And then you use a Power Automate flow in the Power Platform model driven app, and you call that Logic App internally through a HTTP connector or custom connector, which requires a premium license, right? So this is how you would choose different technologies. So you would choose Power Automate to communicate between your model driven app and the flow, and then you call the Logic App exposed through API internally, right? And Once this loan is passed, the next task is that the customer who requested this loan, their information needs to go into this customer information management system, which is a VB.NET Windows application that we talked about, right? So to sync that, what we do is we create a desktop flow wherein we capture the actions that a particular officer might do while feeding the information into that desktop app, and we create a desktop flow out of it, and we invoke that flow rather than creating it in logic app or uh, digital process automation flow, right? So we create a dedicated desktop flow for that and sync the information once the loan is passed. So this was a very high level overview of a use case, right? But I hope it provides you the some sort of insights into how you need to approach a particular use case and see uh, what are the requirements, and then make a decision on whether you use logic apps or power automate, right? So because power automate has different use cases and logic apps has different use cases, so what you need to do is, in conclusion, there would be no straight answer to the question whether you use power automate or logic apps. It depends upon the use case and the requirement. The decision that you need to make is basically based upon the comparisons that I showed you earlier, right? You need to take the use case, check the requirement from your operations, ALM, security, governance, build intended target audience, right? You have to check all these points and then do a comparison and contrast between your Azure Logic App and Power Automate, and then select the best technology. Because uh, if you get stuck, or if the organization gets stuck with saying that no, I will only use Power Automate or I'll only use Logic App, they will not be successful, because each set of technology has their own set of uses and advantages, so to speak, right? So we need to mix and match as and when required. So I hope this gives you some level of idea on how to make a selection from one technology or other. And if you have any questions, I'll take them now, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn separately or Twitter, and yeah, we can have a chat.